I presume that ADHD comes in a huge spectrum of different.
It is a spectrum, you're right. Yeah. And most pediatricians are trained to diagnose ADHD. It is a spectrum. On the lower end, if you will, it's just inattention. So people who just can't pay attention, but they're not hyper, they're not restless, they don't shake or move a lot. They're just still, but their mind is worrying and moving into many, many directions, so they cannot focus. And then on the other end of the spectrum, they're extremely hyper. They cannot sit still for 1 second. They're constantly jumping around and moving around. And most kids are somewhere in the middle. Sometimes you do see ADD children and very, very hyper ADHD children, but most of the kids are in the middle, and we call them combined. So that diagnosis gets the term combined HD, combined type. And when a doctor diagnoses it, there's not like a test to pin the diagnosis. It's mainly we get behavioral questionnaires from the teachers, from the parents. We observe them in the office. So we get more like a testimonial, but an objective testimonial from these authority figures in the child's life to say, yeah, the child kind of behaves that way all over the place. It's not just at home. It's not just at school. It might happen at church or daycare, or other places. And then we kind of come into the consensus that most likely the child has that label, and it's just a label of the symptoms that we're seeing. So it's not a test.
Boys and girls show the same signs of ADHD.
They can. So there is a spectrum for ADHD. It can be ADD on one end, which is attention deficit disorder only without the hyperactivity. And the other end of the spectrum is the extreme hyper child. And most kids fall somewhere in between. Girls tend to lean more towards the ADD without the hyperactivity. Boys lean more towards the hyperactive side. But it is a spectrum. And I've seen girls be extremely hyper, and I've seen boys be very quiet. And the only way we knew they had ADDs is from their Connor forms, the objective histories that we take and the scores that we do.
Video games. Should my child stop playing video games?
Not necessarily. I don't think that video games cause ADHD. I think the trap with video games is that they get such a dopamine high playing those games. With every level, with every win, they're getting a dopamine release. So it's a very rewarding experience, and they become addicted to it. And so if we let them play 12 hours a day, they're never going to let go of the game. We have to say we have a time limit, put on like automatic turn off or whatever, so that you're not getting into a fight over the time limit. But I think putting time limits and restrictions and making them go outside and play is much better.
Is ADHD a superpower?
It can be.
I love that question. I love that question.
Yeah, it can be. Those children are extremely personable. They're a lot of fun. They're extremely creative. They're business minded and entrepreneurial minded. So it can be a superpower. Some of the biggest entrepreneurs, the Virgin guy, what's his name?
Branson?
Branson, yeah, high ADHD, okay? And I don't think he was ever on medication, but he eats well, and he's found the right people to support him because he's just full of brilliant ideas, but he finds people to execute on his ideas. So he's built an empire by being in his zone of genius, which is just a fountain of ideas. So yes, it can be a superpower.
ADHD exists 50 years ago, or was it a result of our environment with toxins and additives in food, etc.?
It's really a combination. It's a blend of genes and hereditary tendencies and the environment becoming more toxic, our diet becoming more toxic. When I grew up in the Middle East, I would eat bread and dairy all the time. That was my staple, right? But when I moved to the States, I no longer can eat that because everything has glyphosate in it. Glyphosate is that Roundup pesticide that's in our food. I'm allergic to it in a way that makes me very sick. So I cannot eat those foods. And I think these children also have food sensitivities that we need to identify, and pesticide sensitivities and mold sensitivities. So that's where the functional testing is really brilliant. It reveals some of those tendencies that we wouldn't know without the testing.
Read about GABA and brain function. Is this a worthwhile supplement?
GABA is one of the serotonergic supplements. It makes you feel good. It helps you relax and sleep. So if they're having issues with that department, then yes. Some of the studies that I've looked at, 5-HTP, that 5-hydroxytryptophan, was actually more effective in helping children with ADHD, almost as effective as Adderall in some of the studies. So I don't tend to use GABA to treat the ADHD symptoms so much, but I do use it for sleep issues. I tend to recommend the 5-HTP more.
Is that because it's further down the line as a precursor for?
It's just a different part of the brain. I think 5-HTP can lead to serotonin directly and to melatonin, whereas GABA is working on a different part of the brain, different receptor.
Well, I'll have to investigate and see if we've got those options here.
Yeah.
Last question, ADHD and COVID-19. Is there anything to be concerned about if my child contracts COVID-19?
No, I don't think having ADHD makes you more vulnerable to COVID compared to normal people.